This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Servile State by Hilaire Belloc. Section 5. I concentrate particularly upon these slaves, the great majority of the human beings inhabiting the land, because although there arose in the Dark Ages, when the Roman Empire was passing into the society of the Middle Ages, other social elements within the villa, the freedmen, who owed the lord a modified service, and even occasionally independent citizens present through a contract, terminable and freely entered into, yet it is the slave who is the mark of all that society. At its origin, then, the Roman villa was a piece of absolute property, the production of wealth upon which was due to the application of labour to the natural resources of the place, and that slave labour was as much the property of the lord as was the land itself. The first modification which this arrangement showed in the new society which accompanied the growth and establishment of the Church in the Roman world was a sort of customary rule which modified the old arbitrary position of the slave. The slave was still a slave, but it was both more convenient in the decay of communications and public power, and more consonant with the social spirit of the time, to make sure of that slave's produce by asking him for no more than certain customary dues. The slave and his descendants became more or less rooted to one spot. Some were still bought and sold, but in decreasing numbers. As the generations passed, a larger and larger proportion lived where and as their fathers had lived, and the produce which they raised was fixed more and more at a certain amount, which the lord was content to receive and asked no more. The arrangement was made workable by leaving to the slave all the remaining produce of his own labour. There was a sort of implied bargain here, in the absence of public powers and in the decline of the old highly centralized and vigorous system which could always guarantee to the master the full product of the slave's effort. The bargain implied was that if the slave community of the villa would produce for the benefit of its lord not less than a certain customary amount of goods from the soil of the villa, the lord could count on their always exercising that effort by leaving to them all the surplus, which they could increase if they willed indefinitely. By the 9th century, when this process had been gradually at work for a matter of some 300 years, one fixed form of productive unit began to be apparent throughout Western Christendom. The old absolutely owned estate had come to be divided into three portions. One of these was pasture and arable land, reserved privately to the lord, and called domain, that is, the lord's land. Another was in the occupation, and already almost in the possession, practically though not legally, of those who had once been slaves. A third was common land owned, over which both the lord and the slave exercised each their various rights, which rights were minutely remembered and held sacred by custom. For instance, in a certain village, if there was a beech pasture for 300 swine, the lord might put in but 50. 250 were the rights of the village. Upon the first of these portions, domain, wealth was produced by the obedience of the slave for certain fixed hours of labour. He must come so many days a week, or upon such and such occasions, all fixed and customary, to till the land of the domain for his lord, and all the produce of this must be handed over to the lord, though, of course, a daily wage in kind was allowed, for the labourer must live. Upon the second portion, land in villanage, which was nearly always the most of the arable and pasture land of the villa, the slaves worked by rules and customs which they gradually came to elaborate for themselves. They worked under an officer of their own, sometimes nominated, sometimes elected, nearly always in practice a man suitable to them and more or less of their choice. Though this cooperative work upon the old slave ground was controlled by the general customs of the village, common to the lord and slave alike, and the principal officer over both kinds of land was the Lord Steward. Of the wealth so produced by the slaves, a certain fixed portion, estimated originally in kind, was payable to the Lord's bailiff and became the property of the Lord. Finally, on the third division of the land, the waste, the wood, the heath, and certain common pastures, wealth was produced as elsewhere by the labour of those who had once been the slaves, but divided in customary proportions between them and their master. Thus such and such a water meadow would have grazing for so many oxen. The number was rigidly defined, and of that number so many would be the lord's and so many the villagers'. During the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries this system crystallized, and became so natural in men's eyes that the original servile character of the working folk upon the villa was forgotten. The documents of the time are rare. These 3 centuries are the crucible of Europe, and record is drowned and burnt in them. Our study of the social conditions, especially in the latter part, are the matter rather of inference than of direct evidence. But the sale and purchase of men, already exceptional at the beginning of this period, is almost unknown before the end of it. Apart from domestic slaves within the household, slavery in the old sense, which pagan antiquity gave that institution, had been transformed out of all knowledge, and when with the 11th century the true Middle Ages began to spring from the soil of the Dark Ages, and a new civilization to arise, though the old word service, the Latin for a slave, is still used for the man who works the soil, his status in the now increasing number of documents which we can consult is wholly changed. We can certainly no longer translate the word by the English word slave. We are compelled to translate it by a new word with very different connotations, the word serf. The serf of the early Middle Ages, of the 11th and early 12th centuries, of the Crusades and the Norman Conquest, is already nearly a peasant. He is indeed bound in legal theory to the soil upon which he was born. In social practice all that is required of him is that his family should till its quota of servile land, and that the dues to the lord shall not fail from absence of labour. That duty fulfilled, it is easy and common for members of the serf class to enter the professions and the church, or to go wild, to become men practically free in the growing industries of the towns. With every passing generation the ancient servile concept of the labourer's status grows more and more dim, and the courts and the practice of society treat him more and more as a man strictly bound to certain dues and to certain periodical labour within his industrial unit, but in all other respects free. As the civilization of the Middle Ages develops, as wealth increases, and the arts progressively flourish, this character of freedom becomes more marked. In spite of attempts in time of scarcity, as after a plague, to insist upon the old rights to compulsory labour, the habit of commuting these rights for money payments and dues has grown too strong to be resisted. If at the end of the 14th century, let us say, or at the beginning of the 15th, you had visited some squire upon his estate in France or in England, he would have told you the whole of it. These are my lands. But the peasant, as he was now, would have said also of his holding, this is my land. He could not be evicted from it. The dues which he was customarily bound to pay were but a fraction of its total produce. He could not always sell it, but it was always inheritable from father to son, and in general, at the close of this long process of 1,000 years, the slave had become a free man for all ordinary purposes of society. He bought and sold, he saved as he willed, he invested, he built, he drained at his discretion, and if he improved the land, it was to his own profit. Meanwhile, side by side with this emancipation of mankind in the direct line of descent from the old chattel slaves of the Roman villa, went, in the Middle Ages, a crowd of institutions which all similarly made for a distribution of property, and for the destruction of even the fossil remnants of a then forgotten servile state. Thus the industry of every kind in the towns, in transport, in crafts, and in commerce, was organized in the form of guilds. And a guild was a society particularly cooperative, but in the main composed of private owners of capital, whose corporation was self-governing and was designed to check competition between its members, to prevent the growth of one at the expense of the other. Above all, most jealously did the guild safeguard the division of property, so that there should be formed within its ranks no proletariat upon the one side and no monopolizing capitalist on the other. There was a period of apprenticeship at a man's entry into a guild, during which he worked for a master, but in time he became a master in his turn. The existence of such corporations as the normal units of industrial production, of commercial effort, and of the means of transport is proof enough of what the social spirit was which had also enfranchised the labourer upon the land. And while such institutions flourished side by side with the no longer servile village communities, freehold or absolute possession of the soil, as distinguished from the tenure of the serf under the lord, also increased. These three forms under which labour was exercised, the serf, secure in his position, and burdened only with regular dues, which were but a fraction of his produce; the freeholder, a man independent save for money dues, which were more of a tax than a rent; the guild, in which well-divided capital worked co-operatively for craft production, for the transport, and for the commerce of all three between them, were making a society which should be based upon the principle of property. All or most the normal family should own, and on ownership the freedom of the state should repose. The state, as the minds of men envisioned at the close of this process, was an agglomeration of families of varying wealth, but by far the greater number owners of the means of production. It was an agglomeration in which the stability of this distributive system, as I have called it, was guaranteed by the existence of cooperative bodies, binding men of the same craft or of the same village together, guaranteeing the small proprietor against loss of his economic independence, while at the same time it guaranteed society against the growth of a proletariat. If liberty of purchase and of sale, of mortgage and of inheritance was restricted, it was restricted with the social object of preventing the growth of an economic oligarchy which could exploit the rest of the community. The restraints upon liberty were restraints designed for the preservation of liberty, and every action of medieval society, from the flower of the Middle Ages to the approach of their catastrophe, was directed towards the establishment of a state in which men should be economically free through the possession of capital and of land. Save here and there in legal formula, or in rare patches isolated and eccentric, the Servile institution had totally disappeared. Nor must it be imagined that anything in the nature of collectivism had replaced it. There was common land, but it was common land jealously guarded by men who are also personal proprietors of other land. Common property in the village was but one of the forms of property, and was used rather as the flywheel to preserve the regularity of the cooperative machine than as a type of holding in any way peculiarly sacred. The guilds had property in common, but that property was the property necessary to their cooperative life. Their halls, their funds for relief, their religious endowments, as for instruments of their trades. Those instruments were owned by the individual members, not by the guild, save where they were of so expensive a kind as to necessitate a corporate control. Such was the transformation which had come over European society in the course of 10 Christian centuries. Slavery had gone, and in its place had come that establishment of free possession which seemed so normal to men and so consonant to a happy human life. No particular name was then found for it. To day, and now that it has disappeared, we must construct an awkward one, and say that the Middle Ages had instinctively conceived and brought into existence the distributive state. The end of section 5.